fundamental structural error in how we model human satisfaction in the West. The baseline assumption, the algorithm that drives our politics, our sociology, and our economic planning, is a linear model of progression. It tells us that as your material positioning improves, as you acquire more capital, status, and education, your perception of the system should proportionally improve. You get more of the pie, you like the bakery. It makes intuitive sense. It's also completely false. The data is telling us a completely different story, but we refuse to read it because it violates the folklore. We're looking at a phenomenon I call the material position inversion. The data proves that as material positioning improves, perception of the system inversely degrades. Wealth and status are not currently buying optimism. They're buying hyper-awareness, fragility, and systemic dread. To understand the mechanics of this, we have to look at the OG canary in the coal mine. The dating market. If you want to know how a demographic actually views its future, do not look at what they say on a survey about the GDP. Look at how they filter for reproduction and partnership. Let's look at the numbers. In a comprehensive polling set conducted by Merlin for the New Statesman, researchers split Gen Z women among strict socioeconomic lines. They used the UK demographic classifications, ABC1, representing the upper and middle classes, those with higher education, managerial roles, and capital access, and C2DE, representing the working and lower classes, manual workers, state pensioners, and those at the lower end of the economic ladder. If the standard linear model holds true, the ABC1 women, the ones with the best material positioning, the highest education, and the most systemic power, should exhibit the highest degree of optimism and the most structural grace toward their male counterparts. The C2DE women, facing actual material scarcity, should be the most defensive, the most guarded, and the most pessimistic. The exact opposite is true. According to the data, 61% of C2DE Gen Z women hold positive views on men. They are operating in a lower economic bracket, but their interpersonal baseline remains fundamentally optimistic. Now look at the upper middle class. Only 36% of ABC1 Gen Z women hold positive views on men. Let that structural gap sink in. 61% versus 36%. This is not a minor statistical anomaly. This is a massive, glaring asymmetry. The demographic with the highest level of systemic safety is outputting the highest level of social and interpersonal hostility. But this is not just about dating. The dating market is merely the highest stakes signaling game we play. The hostility in the dating market is a proxy for a much larger structural inversion. The ABC1 negativity is bleeding out of the interpersonal realm and directly into their perception of the entire economy. Why? Why do better positioned demographics output higher negativity? Because elevated position increases exposure to systemic fragility. When you're operating in the C2DE bracket, the economy is an environment you survive. Your problems are absolute: rent, groceries, baseline material acquisition. The variables are hard, but they're simple. When you cross the threshold into the ABC1 bracket, your problems shift from absolute to relative. You're no longer playing a game of baseline survival. You're playing a game of peer competition. And peer competition is a zero-sum, high-anxiety blood sport. In the upper middle class, your status is entirely dependent on arbitrary shifting goalposts. Did you get into the right university? Are you in the right tier of the managerial class? Are you tracking with your cohort? This demographic has enough education to understand the macroeconomic cliffs approaching and enough capital to be terrified of losing it. Sociologist W.G. Runciman defined this decades ago with his theory of relative deprivation. He proved that people do not evaluate their well-being based on their absolute wealth. They evaluate it based on the reference group they compare themselves to. When you ascend to the upper middle class, your reference group becomes the elite. You are constantly looking upward at a ceiling you cannot break through, while standing on a floor you are terrified will collapse. This brings us to the second mechanism driving the inversion, which is elite overproduction. Peter Turchin modeled this in his perfectly structural demographic theory. We have spent the last 30 years mass producing university graduates and credentialed professionals, but we have not scaled the number of elite positions in society. We've created an entire class of people who were promised a specific high status outcome, only to find that the chairs at the top table are full. So, What does an over-credentialed, highly educated, upper-middle-class demographic do when they realize they might be downwardly mobile? They panic. And that panic does not look like fear. It looks like ideological hostility. It looks like a 36% positivity rate toward the opposite sex. It looks like demanding rigid ideological purity tests, shibboleths, from anyone they interact with. They tighten their filters because their economic reality feels wildly out of control. They use hyperfixation on systemic injustice as a psychological coping mechanism for their own status anxiety. If the system is fundamentally broken, then their inability to secure elite status they were promised isn't their fault. It's a structural crime. Here's the operational takeaway. The public signal you need to remember. If you want to predict political upheaval, economic dissatisfaction, or the next wave of intense cultural conflict, do not look at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. The working class is too busy surviving to engineer a revolution. And as the data shows, their baseline remains surprisingly pragmatic and optimistic. Look at the people sitting at the 80th and 90th percentiles. Look at the upper middle class that feels its grip slipping. Revolutions and systemic disruptions are rarely driven by the starving. They're driven by the downwardly mobile elites and the anxious professionals who realize that the algorithm they were sold is no longer computing. They are the ones who will tear down the system simply because it stopped working exclusively for them. The inversion is real. The higher the material position, the deeper the dread. Stop looking at the floor for signs of collapse. Look at the ceiling.